I kind of have an idea in my head of what we can pull
All right, I'm going to go ahead and call this meeting to order. I'm really happy to have both the City Council and Planning Commission together. I always love it when we're together, so we can kind of synchronize and get on the same page. We'll just go ahead and call roll. Denise?
Good evening. Mayor Smith. Councilmember Dennehy.
Here.
Councilmember Gonzalez. Councilmember Huckes. Councilmember Meisner. Councilmember Reed. Councilmember Brennan Smith.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Hemrick.
Here.
Okay, now Planning Commission, we have Chairman Maloney,
Here.
Commissioner Clark,
Here.
Commissioner Clement, Commissioner Ledoux, Commissioner Brandon Smith, and Commissioner Randy Smith.
Here.
Okay.
Yeah, the old one.
Yeah, we have Dustin Moss here as well.
Do you hear that,
Commissioner Moss.
Denise? Dustin Moss. He's a Commissioner Moss. M-A-A-S.
Oh, he's not, okay.
And
Okay.
Commissioner Brandon Smith is no longer an official commissioner.
Representative.
He's just a representative,
liaison.
just a liaison.
Yeah.
For the public record, if you see us not wearing masks, that's because we do have a member in our group that is hearing impaired, and they need to be able to read our lips. But with that, we're going to turn our time over to Patrick, which will get us started.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming. The last time we were together like this was in July. You may recall that was when we introduced you to John Houseseal from Houseseal Levine. And in addition to walking you through some of the processes that we're going through, he also conducted a workshop where Planning Commission and Council kind of jointly determined what you perceive some of the top priority items to be, or some of the things you would like to see changed if you could, some of the assets that Canyon City has. And that really began, getting the ball rolling on this whole update to not only our comprehensive plan, but our zoning, subdivision, and development standard regulation. Since that meeting, what we've done is get our website active, the Picture Canyon City 2040 websites. In fact, as of this morning, I have updated statistics as to the activity that's happened out there. The community questionnaire that's on the website has so far had 392 people take the questionnaire. Our community facilities survey questionnaire, which was sent out to public agencies to identify what facilities and services they think that they may need to bring on in the near term, has had 24 responses so far. And the map.social feature on the website has had 27 maps and 134 comments to date. So a lot of public input has been given. We also have, in September, we kicked off the big push for our public outreach effort. This involved not only a workshop with the Fremont Economic Development Commission. We had a community engagement presentation the evening of September 16th at the Abbey Event Center, which was also live streamed on the city's Facebook page. And it was kind of an interesting presentation because as they walked through certain things, they came to questions, polls, if you will. And the people who were there in the meeting, or the people who were watching via Facebook, were able to, via the use of an app on their phones, instantly register their preferences. It was very interesting watching the results fluctuate as the votes tallied in. And in fact, not only that PowerPoint presentation, but the results, the final results that we got from the evening for each of those questions are items that you can access from the Picture Canyon City 2040 website as well. During all of this time, the folks from Houseseal Levine have also been going around conducting their own sort of self-drive tours and analyses, taking pictures, taking notes, identifying some of the things that they came across about the community. And as a result of all of this, not only the fact finding, but the public input, they put together the reports that are part of the introductory phase to where we are. You'll recall that one of the things John Houseseal presented in July was When you boil down comprehensive planning for a municipality to its essence, there are basically 3 steps. Identifying where you are, identifying where you want to be, and then what is the clear path to get to those. So right now we're at the where we are stage. So you got 2 reports that were included with your agenda packet. One was the existing conditions analysis report. That was the longer of the 2. But there was also a diagnostic report concerning our titles 16 and 17 of the land use code. So to present those 2 items to you this evening, those 2 reports to you, we've got Josh Halsey and Jackie Wells, both of Halsey Levine. Josh is going to handle the existing conditions analysis report. Jackie is going to handle the diagnostics report. Each of them has a presentation that's about 20 to 30 minutes long. And at the end of that, if you could hold your questions to the end, they're going to provide about 15 minutes each for questions. And that should keep us within the 90-minute time frame that we committed to you. Whenever we do these joint meetings, we hopefully won't go beyond. So with that, I will turn it over to Josh. Good evening, Josh.
Hey, good evening, everyone. Give me just a second. I'm going to share my screen and then I'll get started. Okay, can everybody see that?
Jeff,
Everybody hear me
can
okay?
you hold on a moment? We've got an audio issue on our side.
Why don't you just chatter for us, Josh, so we can adjust the
Yeah, no
volume.
problem. And I wanted to mention that I also have these headphones, which make me look like an air traffic controller, but I can always throw them on, and that's a slightly better microphone than what I'm using on my camera.
How's that for you,
I think
Mindy?
it's good.
messing with it. I think we're okay.
All right, Josh.
All good? Okay. Well, I want to just start by saying thank you to the Council and Planning Commission for having us today. Patrick ran through some of the stats, and I just want to reiterate that we've had a really good first phase of the project, and the team here at House of Levine has really been looking forward to this presentation and to discussing this report with you all. We're excited about the project, and we've been enjoying it so far. So I'll start to dive right into it. The discussion agenda for tonight, like Patrick mentioned, we're going to take about a 20 to 30 minute presentation for each of these 2 sections of the report, each of these 2 reports, the existing conditions report or the ECR, and then also for the diagnostic report. And at the end of each of these sections, after I complete the ECR, we'll take a little time for questions, and then Jackie will do the same. I want to just state this up front. If you think of anything tonight, once the meeting's over, your opportunity for input isn't passed. Please send your questions and comments to Patrick, and the plan is for him to collect all of them and forward them to us, hopefully in the next week or so. We do not want to miss anything or any input as we head into the next phase of the project. So the 2 of us are presenting today. As Patrick said, I'm Josh Kuntz. I'm with House of Levine. We're out of Chicago. I think I met most of you back in July. And then Jackie's also going to be presenting. She'll introduce herself a little bit more later, but Jackie is a planner and a zoning expert out of our office as well. She was out there on the ground in Canyon City in September. There's additional members of the team that are not presenting for this meeting, but are working on this project. That includes John Halsey, co-founding principal of House of Levine, providing project oversight. Tricia Parks is a key part of the project, offering planning expertise and graphics and mapping expertise as well. And then we also partnered with 2 longstanding partners of ours and Colorado-based firms, Tetra Tech for infrastructure, environment, sustainability, and resiliency planning, and JR Engineering for transportation planning. So getting into the project overview, This project includes both the comprehensive plan and an update to the city's development regulations. This is really a best practice. You're updating your development regs, which implement your plan, and we're working on them in tandem. So this is really going to ensure that they're cohesive and complementary. We have done more than 20 projects like this with zoning regulations closely following or overlapping with the comprehensive plan here at House of Levine. I just completed one in Jenks, Oklahoma, and Jackie also has worked on a lot of the projects that go with zoning and comprehensive planning hand in hand. So where are we with the project? We kicked off with project initiation, the branding process to design the logo. When we were out there in July, we had a great staff tour by Jeep of the city. We had our initial meeting with this very group back in July 2020. And John and I also did our first round of land use reconnaissance throughout the city and its urban growth area. And then steps 2, 3, and 8, existing conditions analysis, community engagement, and code assessment, these really all work together in this process. So in these steps, we're getting an understanding of your existing plans and studies and regulations. We went back out there in September and we did another round of the land use reconnaissance on the ground to confirm some of our initial land use observations and take a further look at some of those zoning issues. We also conducted community engagement at the community-wide level with the business workshop, with the community workshop, and in the form of key person interviews for both parts of the project, the comprehensive plan and the zoning diagnostic. So this culmination of steps 1 through 3 and 8 is what we're presenting tonight. This is, just like Patrick said, this is essentially the where we are today in Canyon City for the project, and it's a baseline for the plan and for upcoming recommendations for the code. One other thing to point out is that for our timeline, we are right on schedule so far for the project. Quick snapshot of community outreach. We've had excellent turnout across the board with all of our scoped methods of community outreach. When you add all these up, there's a total of almost 700 engagement responses across all of these forms. So I use that term engagement responses because I wouldn't want to say that we engaged with 700 people. Somebody could have come out for more than one thing. But this is an excellent sampling of the community for Canyon City size. And we, even pre-pandemic, we've seen less turnout at larger communities than this. So we can be proud of these stats. Feedback from outreach is incorporated into both the ECR and the diagnostic reports, which you have in front of you, and it really informs the planning process at this stage and throughout the process. So now getting a little bit into the existing conditions analysis report, the ECR. What is it? It's a snapshot in time, we sometimes say. It's a foundation of common understanding. It attempts to answer that question, where are we today? And I can't stress enough what it's not. It's not the plan. This isn't the plan in front of you yet. This is our presentation of information and documentation that we collected and analyzed during the first phase of the planning process. And the intent here is to ensure that the plan doesn't dismiss previous planning efforts, doesn't start with an attempt at a blank slate, and that the plan really evaluates all the community's past efforts to inform this current planning process. The report identifies subjects of concern to the residents and other stakeholders of Canyon City. It's informed by community outreach. It doesn't present recommendations or preliminary policies at this time. And another thing that I'd like to stress is that it's, Canyon City's a large area, and it's really impossible to capture every single detail and fine grain of the community at this point, but the report needs to establish that baseline of information for the planning process. To put it another way, we really need to know that we have our heads on straight and that we have a general understanding of the community before we get into providing you with new information. So I'm going to take a few minutes. I'm going to touch on some of the higher level takeaways from the report. I think you've all had the document for a couple days, and then we'll get into questions. So your planning context, this is about where we are and what are we planning for. So the comprehensive plan really needs to consider Canyon City's current municipal extent, its priority annexation areas, and pretty importantly for a long-range document, its urban growth boundary. We are not just planning for Canyon City today, but we're planning for the future. We're looking out 2 decades. It's right in the name, Picture Canyon City 2040. And an important part of that is going to include planning for growth. So we looked at existing land use and the full extent of the urban growth boundary. Community outreach themes. We didn't bring these to the planning process. These are what we heard from the community as we undertook those components of outreach that were mentioned at the start of the presentation. So for the plan, the top themes consistently identified in community outreach are really going to start to shape the goals, objectives, and policies in the next stages of the process. The community doesn't write the plan, but this is a community plan, and it's a plan for the community. And these are areas of importance that people articulated needed to be considered and addressed. The ECR identifies key themes, and it pairs those with takeaways from the online community questionnaire. The actions pertaining to these community themes in the document came out of outreach. They're also really important as we start to write recommendations. They're an indicator as to what the community wants to do to address the issues. And those actions aren't recommendations, but that's, again, what we heard from the community. Past plans, they are important. Whether it's a 19-year-old plan or just a 3-year-old plan, they reflect the aspirations and desires of the community. So when we review past plans in the ECR, we don't do this just to check a box, but this is a really important step to help us understand the landscape of planning that has contributed to make Canyon City what it is today. In the ECR, the moving forward sections in the past plans section of the document describe how past plans will be used and considered during planning effort for Picture Canyon City, really to ensure a cohesive planning story that looks to the past and also looks to the future. Demographic and market trends. These are an important measure of how the community is doing as far as population growth, household income, housing type and tenure, commute and labor shed, and more. We rely on census data, and especially in Colorado, or especially for Colorado, Department of Labor statistics to ensure accuracy. This section of the report fits with the idea this is part of that baseline of data that makes Canyon City what it is today. Existing land use. We drove up and down every street in Canyon City, pretty much every street that we had access to verify existing land uses. This map and the accompanying land use definitions represent one of the biggest lifts and data gathering efforts to this so far to this stage in the project. And it represents an understanding of community land use that is really critical before we start to put together the future land use map. So we didn't just verify land uses as we were driving around the community. We also looked at issues, incompatibilities, asset areas. These include growth into the community's peripheral and largely agricultural and open areas on the periphery. We looked at the strength of the downtown, the character of Canyon City's neighborhoods in terms of housing and code enforcement, and we looked at some of your key opportunity sites like the Abbey campus. Your current zoning. This is particularly important for this dual planning and zoning process, as we previously discussed. The ECR presents both your current Canyon City zoning as well as Fremont County zoning within the UGB. Jackie's going to get into this a little further as she starts to get into the diagnostic part of the presentation, but the important takeaway for this report is that zoning is a tool. It's your number one tool to implement your community's vision for future land uses. Once the future land use map is created, your existing zoning map may possibly need some updates to ensure that it aligns with the plan and the community's vision. So transportation, we heard a lot in outreach about getting across Highway 50, especially from downtown to the riverfront. You can see this big red line that bisects the community. Highway 50, the transportation section looks at the city's existing roadway network and it examines issues like the US 50 crossings and the sidewalk network. And we know that transportation is not just about cars. Canyon City has excellent recreational bike trails, but limited on-street bikeways. So for multimodal transportation to be a thing in Canyon City, it's going to be important to consider connectivity to the trail system as well as across Highway 50, and to consider where maybe some of these on-street routes and bikeways are going to need to be. Existing community facilities are an important baseline measure for the ECR. The document establishes where these local points are, and there's a lot of area just in your priority annexation areas. And as new growth occurs, it's going to prompt decision making about new facilities and possibly spur additional facility planning efforts that may come out of the comprehensive plan. For the city's cultural and historic resources, we know that this is a really important point of local pride. Your downtown historic district is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. The historic buildings are really well maintained downtown, but we also heard that additional effort is going to be needed to activate them, especially above the ground floor. There's also an issue that was raised more than a few times with downtown being passed by altogether. We heard a few times that visitors tend to skip right past Main Street and they stay on Highway 50 and they don't even get to enjoy the historic facades and historic street wall that makes up your beautiful downtown. Whether it was in person or online, people generally describe the city's parks and open spaces as areas of strength. And just looking at this map, you can see why. We put the half and quarter mile walk sheds, which are generally your 5 and 10 minute standard walk sheds. We overlaid that with the city's existing residential areas, and you can see that a lot of the city is within good access of a park. The perception of being an outdoor town is only increased when you also consider that this doesn't show walk sheds to your other public lands and regional open spaces. These are areas that are right outside of city limits, and we consistently heard from people how easy it is to come home from work, throw your keys on the counter, and be out on riding some of the best trails or hiking some of the best trails just within minutes of being home from work. So that's kind of the overview of the report. There's obviously more content in front of you in the document. I do have the report open on my desktop, so if you have a question about a specific page number, it's easy for me to flip to it and reference that. So any questions or comments or thoughts about the report so far?
Josh, before we move into questions, would you please put on your headset? I think there's people having some trouble hearing.
No.
Are there any questions?
Yeah,
Mayor Pro Tem?
I've got a couple of questions. On the street ownership on page 49, I'm not sure that you got the jurisdictions exactly right on there yet. It's my understanding that some of East Main is CDOT, And I'm not sure how they got that, whether they just asked somebody or whether there's actually a map somewhere that puts that out, but I would check on that and make sure you've got the street jurisdictions correct. There are some frontage roads that CDOT has responsibility for. Okay, and then also on page 34, you have some dual axis maps where you have two y-axes, and you don't specify what color goes with which axis. So you might add something there for understanding purposes. That's page 34. And that's the two comments I have.
Any other questions? Josh, I had a couple of questions. I was wondering if it was the community feedback that authored the issues and opportunities that were outlined in here, or did that come from House of Levine?
It's a little bit of both. In terms of, I guess it would depend on which section of issues and opportunities you're talking about. The ones that are coupled with the land use section, for example, are pretty much come from our observations. So the ones that are with the chapters are more come out of our observations, and any sort of issues and opportunities that are located in the outreach section are primarily from the community.
Okay,
How's
and
my
then-
audio also, by the way? Is that better?
Yeah, it is a lot better, thank you.
Okay, sorry about that.
And working on the future plan, so this is just the draft, this is community feedback. When House of Levine, when you come forward with our ultimate plan, how detailed will those plans be, like for bike paths and being more multimodal and police facility availability?
Sorry, what was the last part of the question?
How detailed will those plans be coming forward for us to implement?
Sure. So something like a multimodal transportation plan that can be a very deep dive that can warrant its own planning effort that comes separately out of the comprehensive plan. But if as we work with our with JR Engineering and we can identify some sort of key routes, which may be key north-south connections for things like on-street bikeways based on street width and lane configuration, there are some specific recommendations that we can start to make in this document. So the focus is always to be as detailed and as appropriate for Canyon City as possible.
But you're saying that you'll be as detailed as possible, but there's a possibility of having to do more studies?
Well, yeah, I guess let me take a step back. The transportation section of the plan will provide specific recommendations for bike and pedestrian mobility, and it will offer new bike ped connections in the form of a map that will show where those ideal connections are, and that could be implemented right out of this plan. Would
What
it
about
be a further study?
What about like sidewalk installations? That seemed to be pretty expensive too, needing to be more pedestrian friendly and having to do more sidewalks.
Sure. Without identifying every single sidewalk gap in the community, the plan will probably provide some specific recommendations for neighborhoods and areas that could benefit from sidewalk implementation and key, pedestrian improvements that can benefit mobility.
And I may have missed it, but we get a lot of community feedback about needing more RV parking, and I didn't see really any mention about RV parking.
That's interesting. I don't think that I heard that in feedback, but that's definitely something that I can jot down. So you're talking about when somebody needs to park their RV for the off season or something like that, or?
Oh, More for tourism, and when visitors come, there's not a place for them to really park their RVs or trailers.
Okay.
Come and experience like Canyon City downtown or our trails and things like that.
Gotcha. That's a great point.
Okay, that's all my questions. Anybody else? All right, we're ready to move on.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen or when we switch over to Jackie, I'll stop sharing my screen and she'll share her screen.
Good evening, everyone. Is everyone able to hear me? Look around
Yeah.
for some head nods. Very good. Thank you all so much for having us here tonight. Like Josh said, my name is Jackie Wells, and I'll be leading the charge on the land development regulations update portion of this project. So the first sort of step of the land development regulations update is a diagnostic report. So this diagnostic report is a analysis of the existing zoning ordinance and subdivision regulation. So it's really very similar to the ECR in that it applies that foundation of understanding of what the existing issues and opportunities are within your existing code. It also provides a comparative analysis of best practices that are used in other municipalities throughout the United States. So we're looking at your existing zoning regulations, your existing subdivision regulations, and comparing them to what similar communities are doing throughout the country. This report does not include any recommendations for revisions. So we really wanted to bring to you sort of best practices research and an analysis of your existing code before we make any recommendations to ensure that we have a firm understanding of how the codes are utilized within Canyon City and how they should be revised going forward. So the diagnostic report has three main sections. First, a community outreach overview. So not only does this include the feedback that we heard through our 13 stakeholder interviews, it also includes information that we heard from residents and participants of all other outreach events that we are sort of framing through a zoning lens. It wasn't necessarily outreach that was specifically about the zoning or subdivision regulations, but we can, through our expertise, understand their issues and how to implement them through the zoning code update. So then we'll be moving into an overview of our assessment of Title 17, the zoning code, and Title 16, the subdivision code. So these assessments include our overall code observations, section-specific issues, and then best practices applicability. So starting off with a summary of the feedback from community outreach, I first would really like to emphasize that the feedback here has not been edited or nothing has been omitted based on a misunderstanding of the development regulation. So if an interviewee that we spoke with had a misconception or a misunderstanding of the development regulations, we chose not to exclude those comments from the code since they are very important to ensuring that when we update the regulations, we clarify all of those misunderstandings. So we broke down the feedback that we heard into 5 different sections, starting off with ease of use. So throughout our interviews and throughout community outreach, we heard that the current zoning code is pretty difficult for sort of lay people, residents, and business owners to use. So there's lots of instances of legalese, so uses are words like wherein or hereafter, things that are difficult for the average person to understand. Those types of words are used throughout the code. There also aren't any graphics, diagrams, or other types of visualizations to support the text and really clarify what those really heavy or dense paragraphs of text mean. There was also concern about the organization of the code and how there's not currently a logical format to the structure of the code chapters, and a desire to reorganize the code really came out as a theme throughout community outreach. Moving into our development standards and regulations feedback, one of the main things that we heard was about the subdivision requirements for subdivision within the city. So many people expressed that the requirements are pretty inflexible and can increase the cost of development, making it more difficult to build affordable housing in the community. Next, we heard about the lack of variety of options for stormwater management. So many interviewees discussed how detention was the only option currently available to them for stormwater management on site. And they discussed how other communities that they've been working in have more green infrastructure options that allow them to manage their stormwater more creatively in a more innovative manner. Last but not least, for this section, there's the excessive minimum parking requirements that many interviewees thought was inhibiting infill development, especially around the downtown. Our next sort of general bucket of feedback is related to district-specific issues. First and foremost, interviewees felt that there was inconsistency between city and county regulations, which made it very difficult to develop in areas outside of Canyon City's municipal boundaries, but in that urban growth area. Next, interviewees discussed how residential districts within the downtown, those underlying standards for things like lot area and lot width, could inhibit redevelopment and reinvestment since they just don't match the existing pattern of development on the ground. Along the same vein, interviewees also discussed how there are too few commercial districts and that the 2 districts that currently exist within the city don't really allow for the nuanced regulation that should be existing within the code. So moving on to our permit and decision-making processes, interviewees discussed a lack of clarity and understanding in process requirements. So not only is that a result of the legalese and the lack of graphics and the need to reorganize the code into a more logical format, they also expressed a misunderstanding of the regulations and requirements from staff. Interviewees also discussed the inability within the current subdivision and PUD regulations to allow for a final approval within phases for large development. So if you have a large development, that it would be required to go through the construction specifications for all phases rather than for the first phase and subsequently those later approvals after that, which can add significant cost to a project. Next, interviewees discussed the lack of fair certainty and standards of review within the code and how this can add or could cause delay and prolong the approval processes. Last but not least, the other issues that were discussed, first was a desire for a no closed door policy. So many of the interviewees discussed experiences that they had with the city staff where if the person they were talking to did not know the answer, did not know who to direct them to, they just didn't have a direction to go from there. So there was a real desire expressed for a no closed door policy where if the staff person they were speaking to didn't have the information they needed, they had the person to direct them to that had that information. And last but not least, one thing that we heard throughout the interviews, although it's not specifically related to development regulations, really wanted to bring it up because it was so consistent throughout those interviews, was the need to diversify the local economy. So moving into our initial code assessment of Title 17. So first, an overall zoning code observations. So the first thing that we noticed was an inconsistency in numbering. The first couple chapters go from 1704, 1708, 1712. So they have the four numbers separating them, and then it goes to 2 numbers, and then it's just very inconsistent in the numbering, which is often a result of amendments to the code over time, but can make it confusing for new code users. The next 2 things that we noticed are in regards to the public notice requirements and processes for the city. So first and foremost, we noticed that there was not a requirement to include renters and tenants. And although this isn't required by the state, many municipalities are choosing to require notice to renters and tenants to ensure that there's equitable notice throughout the community. Next, we noticed that there's lack of clarity on who is responsible for actually sending these public notices. Many municipalities put the onus on developers to send public notices to ensure that really the responsibility for a efficient public process is on the developer rather than on the city. And then last but not least, the absence of graphics and other visualizations, as was discussed in the community outreach overview. Graphics and visualizations can really help to strengthen understanding of regulations, but it can also help to increase the defensibility of the code. If they're if there's opportunity for multiple interpretations of a regulation, that could make the city's interpretation either unclear or undefensible. So having the text backed up through a graphic really makes that text more defensible in court. So moving into our first chapter of the zoning codes, section 1704, the general provisions and zoning map. So this section really sets up the defensibility of the code up front, but it also includes process-specific regulations like the vesting of property rights and zoning code processes. Many municipalities will include these in the administration and enforcement section to really streamline that organization and ensure that code users know exactly where to go to find the information that they need. Next, we move into our definition section. So the definitions are located not only in section 1708, but also throughout the code in various sections. Many municipalities are choosing to consolidate all of the definitions to not only streamline the understanding of the code language, but to also ensure that if there are any amendments to the code, that they are consistent throughout the document. Many municipalities are also locating definition sections at the end of the zoning code to act as more of a reference or an index to the code rather than a really hefty or lengthy section that code users would have to flip through in order to get to the real meaty sections that they're interested in. Next, there is a lack of supporting graphics. So just like graphics are needed to support actual regulation, graphics are needed to support definitions as well. There's also a lack of definitions for new and modern uses. So this is a result of the code not being comprehensively updated in a significant period of time. So for things like tiny homes or other types of uses that the city would like to accommodate, there isn't a clear pathway to do that now. There are also some instances of redundant or overly similar definitions. For example, the definitions for animal boarding and kennels are very similar to one another. It'd be difficult to tell the difference between the two, even though there are different regulations governing the two different uses. So next we move in to section 1712. So this is our districts and general regulations section. This really sets up what many people think of when they think of zoning. So the zoning district that your property is in, and then those regulations that govern what you can do with your property. So the section begins with our purpose and intent statements for the various districts throughout the city. Many of these districts, our purpose and intent statements are very brief, and they don't provide you all with the information you need to make really informed decisions on map and text amendments. So many municipalities update their purpose and intent statements based on future land use map land use categories. So this can help to align the zoning code with the comprehensive plan. So next we have lists of permitted and special uses, as well as yard and bulk requirements listed for all of the districts. So you have for your residential districts, it's all listed separately, et cetera. So this can cause redundancy throughout the code and can make amending the code pretty difficult. So to address this, many municipalities are consolidating all of these lists into one table. So you would have one table for your permitted and special uses and another table for your yard and bulk requirements. So not only does this really streamline the code, but it also allows users to compare requirements across districts. So if I'm a property owner and I am thinking of rezoning my property, I'm very easily able to compare what is permitted in one district compared to another. Next, the residential districts. We notice that there's no residential district that permits a mix of housing types. Residential developments with a variety of housing types like single family detached homes, as well as small lot, large lot instances of that housing type, as well as townhomes and multifamily is a very desirable type of development and pattern of development for key age groups like millennials and seniors. We also notice that there are limited commercial districts. So there are only 2 commercial districts currently in the city, one that governs downtown and then one that governs everything else. The district that governs everything else governs things as far as big box stores to small commercial retail, which can make it very difficult for the city to regulate those 2 types of commercial development differently. Moving into section 17.13 are administrative exceptions. I was very glad and very happy to see this section within the code, allowing administrative relief for items like yard and bulk requirements can really streamline the approval process, especially for residents, and can make can really resolve some headaches that would otherwise be required to go through a variance process. So it's very in line with best practice to have an administrative exceptions section. However, it's disjointed from some of those other approval processes, which are located later in the zoning code. It is also limited to administrative exceptions only for yard and bulk requirements. So many other communities are allowing for administrative relief for things like required landscaping or sign area, just to streamline process for all users. Moving into section 17.14, the transitional mixed use overlay zone. Just like all the other overlay zones within the city, they are not established with the base zoning district. So it makes it difficult for users to understand how the two types of districts interplay with one another. This district also establishes specific performance standards that are seemingly only applicable to the transitional mixed use overlay zone, whereas there are no performance standards for the other districts in the city. This district also establishes a requirement for site plan review, but it does not give the type of standards that would really be beneficial for you all in the review of those site plans. So the design and architectural standards, so establishing what is desired in those areas, so you have some benchmarks for that site plan review process. Next, moving into section 17.15, the accessory dwelling units. This is another section that we were very excited and happy to see. It's very progressive to include allowances for accessory dwelling units, and the regulations that are included here are really in line with industry standard. Again, it's isolated from those other relevant code sections, so it can be difficult for code users to understand how accessory dwelling units interplay with the other residential districts. So moving into section 1716 and 1717. So both of these are planned unit development processes. One is a planned development district and the other is a planned unit development. So in many of the municipalities that we work in, they have one or the other. Both processes could possibly be redundant. So further discussion with you all and with staff will be needed to really understand the benefit and the, what the city gets out of having both processes and how they need to be revised to really be distinct from one another. Next, we get into section 1718, which is the riverfront zone districts. We understand that this is a new district that is hasn't been implemented yet in terms of development or rezoning. We did have a couple of concerns with the text as it is written currently. First, it's unclear whether the districts are base districts or overlay districts. So clarity in terms of the code organization would definitely be beneficial there. We also think that there might potentially be deficient minimum setbacks required from the riverfront as the text is currently written. From discussions with staff, we understand that the setbacks are actually from the easement for the riverfront trail, but the code language doesn't make that clear. So next we move into section 1720, the supplementary provisions and design requirements. So this section contains a wide variety of standards that is not necessarily intuitive for a code user to know to look here. So it seems like it's sort of a catch-all for the types of additional standards that were added into the code over time. Some specific sections of this code or of this section that we thought required some additional analysis. First is animal boarding. So these standards do not address hours of operation, especially for outdoor activity or noise abatement requirements. It also doesn't establish required setbacks for outdoor animal runs. So these are both essential for ensuring that animal boarding does not become a nuisance for adjacent land uses. Next, we move into the design requirements in the CBD. As we understood, this section only really establishes a height restriction in the district and doesn't really include any architecture or design standards for infill development. Next, for fences, walls, and hedges, there are no regulations for fences in side and rear yards of lots in residential districts, nor any regulations for fences in non-residential districts. There's also not a list of permitted or prohibited fence material, so it's sort of a any material works. Next, moving into screening. The screening requirements are only established for salvage yards, extractive industries, and display lots used for commercial goods. Many communities expand their screening requirements to include things like trash and recycling receptacles, roof-mounted mechanical equipment, ground-mounted mechanical equipment, some of those other things that are eyesores. They're necessary, but they're eyesores. And last but not least, yard exceptions. So although this section has some great standards that are in line with industry standard, it does not include any provisions for permitted yard encroachment. So things like decks or air conditioning condensers, those types of things that would be required or naturally be within those required yards. There's no standard to allow for those. Moving into section 1723, our conditional use standards. The process for conditional uses was generally in line with industry standard. However, there was a lack of clear standards of review, which is really beneficial for not only the user to understand, sort of what that standard it is that they need to meet, but also for staff. So conditional uses are approved by staff. So having those clear standards of review is really necessary to ensure that staff is not in a position where the decisions they make could be considered arbitrary or capricious. Next, we move into section 1724, uses permitted by special review. So the majority of this chapter is really dedicated to a very long list of the various special review approvals throughout the city. So this type of list is not only long and cumbersome to get through for code users, but it also requires that the city amend its zoning code whenever it approves a special use permit or a special review permit, which can be an administrative burden on staff. The section also includes review and approval procedures for rafting takeouts. This seemed very buried to us and not like an appropriate location for this type of language. So next we move into section 1728, our off-street parking and loading requirements. So the first thing we noticed was there is an overall exemption for parking within the central business district. So although this is best practice for commercial uses within the central business district or in downtowns in general, many municipalities do not extend this exemption to residential uses. If there's going to be a significant residential population within a downtown area, having sufficient parking for those people is really necessary to ensure that there's not an overly overburdensome on the on-street parking. Next, the minimum requirements for off-street parking are really in line with industry standards. So we heard that through community outreach, there was concern that the minimum standards were really requiring too much parking, and that was inhibiting some infill development. And we think that although the minimum requirements are really in line with industry standard, there's opportunity to allow for additional alternative credits and reductions to consider things such as access to alternative modes of transportation to allow reductions in required parking in certain areas that can really support it. We also notice that there are no maximum parking requirements. So if a developer desired to pave their whole lot and make everything a parking lot, they would be able to do so. So many municipalities are moving into a maximum parking requirement to not only ensure that there's sufficient room for landscape, but also to help manage stormwater. So next, moving into 17.30, signs. So the majority of the communities that we work in have issues with content-based regulations, which have been deemed unconstitutional or no longer legal by the Supreme Court decision that happened in 2016 in the case called Reed versus the Town of Gilbert. So luckily, the city of Canyon City does not have those issues. So I congratulate you. You are within the maybe 15% of communities throughout the nation that are not suffering from these issues or these concerns. However, there are some other areas or issues within the sign code that we identified and wanted to bring to your attention. So first, the sign code does not prohibit signs from covering architectural features of the buildings upon which they are placed. So wall signs could be placed covering beautiful cornices of the downtown really historic buildings that you have, or other architectural features that really define the character of businesses and buildings within the city. The sign code also allows for projecting signs to really project way farther into or from the building than the majority of municipalities do. So 6 feet in the commercial, in the central business district, and 12 feet in the other commercial districts. So this can really make it it can be very imposing for pedestrians. So projecting signs are really meant to be pedestrian-oriented signs, and the majority of municipalities have that maximum projection at 4 feet. The Canyon City sign code also allows for some sign types that many municipalities are choosing to prohibit going forward. Things like roof signs, billboards, off-premises signs, or pole and pylon signs. Next, the amount of wall sign area is excessive when compared to the types of buildings or the scale of buildings that you have, especially in the downtown. So up to 100 square feet is allowed regardless of building size, plus an additional 50 square feet is allowed if the building does not have a freestanding sign. Many municipalities are choosing to allow for proportional sign allowances, so it would be based on the size of the facade. So it would be a certain percentage could be covered by a sign to ensure that the signs are proportional with the buildings that they are located on. Next, the sign code allows for painted and attached wall signs to be located on the same facade. This can really lead to visual clutter and to decreasing the appearance or the visual quality of an area. Next, we have an allowance for one freestanding sign up to 4 square feet on a residential lot, and this is without a permit. And many municipalities allow for this type of sign if it's temporary, but not if it's permanent. And the current regulation is not clear as to whether that allowed 4 square feet of signage would be permanent or temporary. Next, also in residential districts, there's an allowance for up to 32 square feet of sign area with the issuance of a permit. And this is compounded by the fact that that sign is allowed to be illuminated and affixed to a building. So you see that type of allowance in commercial districts or non-residential districts all the time. That's very common, but within a residential district, that can be very easily change the character of a residential neighborhood. Moving into section 1744, the administration and enforcement section, the processes and the various administration powers or different responsible parties, the way that those are spelled out is in line with industry best practice. However, there is a lack of detail for the enforcement powers for the city. So many municipalities are expanding their enforcement sections to not only give detail on the types of violations of the zoning code, but also to spell out the difference between emergency and non-emergency enforcement provisions. There were several other code sections, including 32, 34, 36, 40, and 45, that we did not have any issues or concerns with up front and thought were very much in line with industry best practice. So we've not included those in detail in this presentation. So next we'll move into our initial assessment of Title 16, the subdivision code. So the Title 16 itself contains 2 sections that set up sort of the defensibility of the subdivision code, and then it references Appendix A, which really is the meat of the subdivision regulation. So those are the subdivision and development regulations sort of appendix section. So this establishes 4 subdivision processes. Feedback from staff has let us know that the minor subdivision and subdivision exemption process is really the most popular and the one that they get requests and applications for most frequently. And this can lead to sort of piecemeal development over time and not sort of a comprehensive approach. So that would lead us to look at the major subdivision process and see where there's areas for improvement to ensure that developers are encouraged to go through a major subdivision process rather than piecemeal their development through the minor subdivision process. So one of the things that we noticed was a requirement for preliminary and final plat approval in separate stages. Many municipalities are allowing for a concurrent review of both the preliminary and final plats to shorten that approval process time period and really be an incentive to development. There's also the conservation subdivision process that's spelled out. Many municipalities are not establishing separate processes for conservation development that would generally go through a major subdivision process. However, for conservation development, there would be incentives to increasing net density, not gross density, but net density, to allow for the preservation of environmentally sensitive areas or open spaces in a market viable manner. Last but not least, Appendix A references a community design principles and development standards article that we were not able to find within either the municipal code or the city's website. So these design principles are definitely necessary to ensure that subdivision development within the city is in line with the community expectations and those standards going forward. So I know that was a lot of information, a lot of regulation talk to go through, which is not always the easiest to digest. So please let me know if you have any questions. I'm happy to answer those now.
And bear in mind, if you want to read through these and, cogitate this for a while and get any comments, I can forward them on to House Levine as well.
Councilor Meisner.
I was under the impression that from the direction of council, that we were going to get rid of 16 and 17 and not rewrite it per se. We were going to develop new sections. And it appears that we're coming back and analyzing what we have in those 2 sections and trying to, I don't know, are we going to wind up trying to take that stuff out, which what I understood in terms of advice from staff is that was so cumbersome and confusing and conflicting that it would take you twice the amount of time to do that versus scrap 16 and 17 and rewrite it. What happened to that philosophy?
Well, what we've got here is a diagnostic of the issues that exist within both 16 and 17.
We already knew that there were issues.
And this is laying it out for you all to see what the issues are.
So what's going to happen from here?
So that's your decision jointly as a group. What directions do you want to give us? Do you want us to merge these into one chapter, scrap whatever's there and rewrite? Do you want us to fine tune where we can fine tune? You let us know.
I want 16 and 17 to be as simple as possible. And that goes back to the concept of saying, if we need to go to another community and find comparable regulations and use those regulations that we know are working, to use those versus to sit down and rehash everything again. And we could spend 3 years on this.
Yeah,
That's not what we talked about.
We definitely understand the concerns that you all have with the existing regulations, and we share them. I hope you understand through this report that we understand and recognize the issues within the existing code. However, there are issues that come along with completely replacing a development regulation section for a city. So things like there are unforeseen consequences, such as creating nonconformities in areas where you otherwise wouldn't desire them. And then replacing things that are currently working for the city in terms of process. So the purpose of the diagnostic is to really understand what is working and what isn't for the city, what should be carried forward and what needs to be replaced. And when we talk about replacing, we also need to talk about revising. So what needs to be fine-tuned and tweaked within the existing regulation instead of a full-out replacement.
I thought we needed a lot more than just fine tuning and tweaking, that it was a lot more clarification, simplification, and streamlining.
That, I don't think, that was the council's goal, and that is to get it streamlined, make it simpler and get this streamlined.
Yeah, so there's definitely potential and possibility to streamline the code and reorganize the existing sections without actually changing any of the actual requirements. So we need to understand what requirements are working, what regulations are working, and then the reorganization of the code, the streamlining of the sections will happen regardless of whether they are new sections that are replacing existing sections or revisions that are happening to existing regulations.
So you're saying you can provide the flow, the clarity, the simplification, the charting, all of that?
Yes, that is going to be the main goal of this process, is to make this code as user-friendly as possible. And that needs to be user-friendly for not only code users, so on the development side or on the resident side, but also for staff and for you all. So you all have an understanding of the existing regulations, staff has an understanding of existing processes. And if those are currently working, we don't want to replace them just for the sake of replacing them, but we want to ensure that they are organized in a manner that is logical, that is streamlined, and that is easier for everyone involved to understand and to use.
Any other comments from council or planning commission?
Okay. So what are we talking about, time frame and cost? Are we talking about another contract and another review?
No, this is all part of the scope of work that we're doing, and it should be finished by April, May timeframe next year.
And we're going to have a new 16 and 17.
We will probably combine them into one chapter, but we'll have a new 16.
How you do it.
That's going to be a lot of work. Looking at all this diagnostics, there's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, we're under no illusion.
Yeah, I've got a comment. For someone like me that doesn't work in the code every day, being an elected official, in the diagnostic report on page 10, you mentioned the 5-foot setback for the river zoning. And you say that's really not industry standard, and you give us some examples of what industry best practices are. And what I would like to understand myself is what is the downside to keeping that 5 foot? And so that maybe that's a general comment throughout the diagnostic reports. When you talk about, well, here's what you got and here's what the industry standard is, understanding some of the downsides of leaving what we've got the way it is would be beneficial for me. And I don't need to, if you're recommending that we consolidate a bunch of requirements into an easily understood table, I don't need you to tell me about that, but using your expertise and knowledge, I'd like to understand some of the downsides of what we have in our current code right now.
Well, and I'd like to piggyback on that, because it seemed like a lot of the recommendations were you need more regulations, you need more, rules for fencing, you need more of that. And sometimes our community doesn't embrace that very well. And so I would need to see a lot of justification for adding additional regulations where I thought we were going to be loosening things up and making some things more flexible.
See, that's exactly the kind of feedback that we need to hear.
Yes, definitely.
If we're going to rewrite 16 and 17 and add more restrictions, you're wasting your money. You're wasting your time as far as I'm concerned. We're already there. I mean, that's why we started this, was to simplify it, make it easier for somebody to do something.
And not to change a lot of that.
Well, I mean, I could see maybe some justification, like if you're going to do huge signs on your side of your building, it needs to be to scale, but I need to understand some of that.
I think we certainly have issues when it comes to signs and cleaning up the signage as part of the code.
You have no idea.
If I could interject on just a couple of these points, I first would like to address the concerns about the riverfront zone districts. So our what we were trying to bring about was not the deficiency of the actual setback requirement, but rather in the language of how that's communicated within the zone district. So in communication with staff, they've let us know that 5 to 10 foot setback requirement is not to the floodway itself, but to the actual easement requirement for the riverfront trail. So that is a really important distinction to make, because development too close to a floodway can lead to issues of flooding and can make it impossible for property owners to receive flood insurance protection through the federal government. Moving into additional standards. So if we've brought up how other municipalities or other communities are regulating things like fences, those are not our recommendations for what Canyon City should do. It's just a identification of best practices in other communities. If those aren't appropriate in Canyon City, we are by no means encouraging that they be adopted or included within the rewritten code. We really need to establish what is appropriate for Canyon City, what the community desires in terms of its aesthetic and its level of development regulation, so that we can ensure that the new code addresses all of those concerns and brings the aesthetic and the vision of Canyon City in the year 2040 to life.
Andy?
I have a question. Was there any consideration or review of neighboring municipalities or the county and those regulations to be able to compare a little bit? For example, when a developer is trying to decide if they want to build in Canyon City or in the county or in Florence or in neighboring communities, was there any review or consideration in that also to compare?
Yes, definitely. So we looked at when we say other municipalities throughout the region or throughout the country within the diagnostic port, that is definitely inclusive of other municipalities within the region. So we based a lot of that comparison on the types of, or on the communities that we heard were competitive with Canyon City through the interviews.
I saw Sterling on that list. I apologize. I'm trying to find a page where it shows those. I didn't see.
On the statistics pages.
What?
Yes, Sterling was statistics pages.
Okay. Well, I'll keep scrolling. But so I saw Sterling on there. Do you remember what other ones were on there? Spare me the.
It was just Sterling and
Reference
Fremont County.
I think Sterling was the only other town that was listed.
I
There's
just-
no other comparison. It was Canyon City and Sterling, which is
Right,
totally two
and
different
that's what I
cultures.
was. That's what was
Well,
triggering
we're
that
both
thought to
prison
me
towns.
too.
That's the only thing. And Sterling has a population of 3,000 of one facility, and then we have about 12 that probably have 3,000. So if they're comparing prison populations, that's what they're doing. But we're still two different cultures.
It's more to, I mean, outside of that, it's a farming community.
Right.
That
They're
is
farming and
flat out a
ranching.
farming community.
And we're
Very.
for tourism. You don't hear a lot of people going to Sterling, biking.
No,
That's
it's farming.
So I believe that's also a conflation of the comparison of Sterling and Canyon City within the ECR in terms of the demographics in the market section, whereas the diagnostic report, the municipalities that were referenced and compared to Canyon City was a broader swath of communities within the region. And it was also taken from our experience working with other Colorado communities that are much more similar to Canyon City in terms of its culture and tourism focus.
I guess my thought process in that would be, and I understand demographically what you were looking at, but if I was a developer and we're saying that we're wanting to look at more major subdivisions as an example, and I'm comparing two cities that are 11 miles apart, I'm saying, okay, in Canyon City, it's going to cost X for a major subdivision, and in Florence, it's going to cost B, and in Salida, it's going to cost C. I would like to understand what some of those differences in cost. Obviously, I understand properties in those cases, but as far as what the actual code is requiring, I would just be curious to see, is Canyon City requiring, 20 more things than our neighboring communities? Because for most, that's probably a dangerous statement, for many people in Canyon City and Florence are so close together that it doesn't matter if you have to commute from one to the other. I understand that they're demographically very different in population, but as far as just in the two areas were so close together. So I would just be curious to see what that looks like, I guess.
And I think that is definitely a fair point. And so the understanding of what is driving a developer from locating in Canyon City versus locating in a neighboring community is essential to ensuring that Canyon City continues to be a desirable community going forward. So in the interviews that we did to better understand those types of motivations, we didn't hear as much about the requirements within the subdivision code itself, but requirements are misunderstandings of the process for approval, adding extra time, which means extra money to subdivision approvals. So that was driving people to other communities. So I think it's more essential not to really compare line item by line item the requirements in the subdivision process, but really taking a hard look at the approval process to ensuring that it is as streamlined and as straightforward as possible, so that you are shortening the time period for approval for developers to ensure that they are not spending extra money getting through the process in Canyon City as they would in other communities.
So if I'm understanding that right, what you're saying, it's the ease of being able to do business with one versus the other more so than it is the documentation in writing itself.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Patrick, you said you needed feedback from council so they could with the documents the way you want it and want to see it. What other kind of are you wanting to see? Do you have questions?
Well, primarily reactions to what this diagnostic has brought up as issues. Do you not agree with them? Do you want some of these recommendations set aside because you don't think we really ought to go there? That would be opening a can of worms at some point. Or do you think there was something that might have been overlooked that should be?
Well, and I myself, I'd like to go through it one more time after doing this. I'd like to go back through and review it and write down. You know, I've got notes that I took tonight, but I'd like to go back through and read it before again and just kind of really take what, you know, they have said and just it'll just process it a little better.
I'd like to hear some input from Planning Commission and Jerry. I mean, Jerry's been involved in this community for a long time, and when I've heard and seen the issues and problems that we're trying to say enough's enough. I mean, what can you shed any more light on my frustration?
I look at those problems different than what we're trying to do here. Hopefully we are trying to simplify some of the stuff we're talking about, but the problem we should go back. Remember that ad hoc committee, which is a bunch of contractors? Those are the guys really steering these conversations. Those are the guys that we can fine tune our code all we want, but it's the contractors that are being told what they can and can't do and have to do, and they're the ones that are frustrated. It would have to be this committee with another ad hoc contractor committee sit down and talk about what we're talking about and where the real on the ground problems are.
And we did bring in contractors as part of that stakeholder meeting for the diagnostic.
We're building and engineering people present during that?
Yes.
Then you're wasting your time.
Well, staff was not there. We wanted to make sure when these interviews were happening that they could say whatever they wanted to the folks from House of Levine, that staff was not going to be there to rebut anything that it was there for. And I think the concept, a theme that we heard frequently was they want the regulations simplified and they want a certain degree of certainty. And once they get into a process that they're going to get successfully to a conclusion in a predictable amount of time.
So
Without changes afterwards.
yeah. Phil Lund, Lester Lamone, Ty Cipher, Chris Cohen, Vicki Poland, Lori Anderson, who is representing Westover Homes, which is a part of Challenger, Dennis Minshaw from 4 Mile, Alex Ewers, an engineer, Matt Koch, John Kratz, Eric Williams from Legacy Land, Bob Leck, and Bernie Brady were part of the stakeholder group for this diagnosis.
So is there an appropriate time to bring them back again to make sure that we are moving in the right direction?
Well, Josh, let me ask you, as we move into our next phases, we need to wrap this one up. So when would be an appropriate time for me to consolidate comments that I get back from planning commission and council?
Yeah, I mean, usually we, you know, you've had it for a few days, but not too long. So these two documents, I think you received on Monday. So that's not a long time to sit with them. I know that. I think we could kind of make the call here in the room, depending on what this group thinks and what you think, Patrick. But I'd say a week, within the next week to, you know, definitely not more than 2 weeks. The goal would be to correct errors, would be an important one, to make sure that there's no factual sort of things or any kind of minor errors like that in the documents. And then if there's any additional input or something that needs to be included in there, we can discuss whether that's included as a sort of an addendum or a memo from this group, or if there needs to be any sort of updates to the document. But the goal here would be, especially since we're on this tight 1-year timeline tied to the DOLA grant, the goal would be to get these, definitely the ECR, and if we want to, we could also put the diagnostic on the website, make it available for public review, and then move on to the next stage of the process, which is the visioning step. And on the zoning side of things, next step is outline of actual code changes in organization. So that's when we start getting into recommendations for the zoning diagnostic and the vision, goals, and objectives, which really form the plan framework. So we want to keep moving and we want to stick to our timeline, but we also want to give this group, this joint council, time to offer good feedback.
You guys need 2 full weeks to give the feedback that you want?
I think 1 is plenty.
So within 1 week to give your feedback. And who, do we give that to Patrick?
Yeah.
Let me be the portal.
Do the stakeholders have a copy of this?
You were the first ones to see it. This was being unveiled tonight for the first time, and you were the audience to see it.
So if we could put it on the website, then we can share it with some of our contacts, especially those who are on the list, and make sure we get their feedback as well. That would
Absolutely.
be appreciated. Can you reach out to those who are part of this process
Get all their emails.
and ask for their feedback as well?
Sure.
I mean, there's still a lot to chew on. It's too bad it can't be condensed, but I mean, Jerry's got a good point that you can rewrite all this one, but if you don't address the confidence that our contractors have in the city and us, you're wasting your time.
Rental developers too.
Right.
If I could for just a minute, I think you hit the nail on the head. That's what this whole process is about, is providing fair certainty, whether you're a resident looking to buy a home, a contractor, or a developer looking to subdivide and develop a attractive land, or even do a smaller development. The plan should really clearly articulate the community's vision, you know, clearly through written text, and then also through maps and graphics. And the zoning code, it's all about clarity and simplicity, and that's the goal of this. That's the goal of this whole process.
Piggybacking off of that, I really want to emphasize and drive home the fact that the time period for allowing your feedback on the diagnostic report isn't limited to the next week. And we would really like to encourage you to not only focus your attention on the diagnostic report, but also to think forward to the preliminary recommendations and then the draft sections that are going to be developed going forward. It's often difficult to review a diagnostic report, review a zoning code, and understand where it's going to be going and how it's going to be revised. As soon as we start making those recommendations for revisions and start drafting actual code sections, there will be something to respond to in terms of changes rather than just identifying issues and concerns with the existing code language. So the opportunity for feedback and for ensuring that those parties and those players that interact with the code most often, we will ensure that they have opportunity to provide feedback up until the time the code is adopted, to ensure that it is really the code that Canyon City needs going forward. This is not a 1 week period and then all opportunity for feedback is closed. We really want to keep that door open to ensure that the code is what it needs to be. That doesn't necessarily mean we will be updating and revising the diagnostic report going forward. This is really meant to be a snapshot of the issues with the existing code, but the preliminary recommendations and then the draft of the zoning code, those will be working drafts until the time of the adoption.
So I appreciate that. Thank you. What I want council and planning commission, remember, this is a work step. This is their diagnostic, this is their deep dive and interpretation of the code. And they want to make sure that what they have put in this diagnostic is consistent with what you have heard. And if there's anything missing from this diagnostic that affect the way they move forward with the project and those future recommendations that they might be making.
So Mandy first.
Jackie, I was just going to recommend, I really like, speaking of concise, the way your slides were when you were going through kind of the Cliff Note version of the things that you saw in each area of the code. I don't know if that's an option to be able to maybe get that document, just out of respect for the time of all the contractors who are hopefully going to be looking at all this. They don't have to read 100 pages. I mean, as much as we'd like to, I just don't think that's realistic. So I really liked the way you had that slide, so if we could share that.
Definitely, we can include this PowerPoint on the project website along with the diagnostic report and the ECR to provide a nice overview of the document. I know not everyone gets as excited to read diagnostic reports as we do, so we want to make that as user-friendly as possible.
Yeah, and even right away tomorrow, we can zip this PowerPoint into a PDF and get it over to Patrick so that this group can have the presentation from tonight.
As you think.
Canyon City Spark Notes.
Okay, so I've got a comment about that. I have two comments to make, which is the planning commission and council's role, and then our stakeholders' role. On the stakeholders' role, I think it's really this document, however long it is, maybe the summary presentation also going with it, needs to be provided to the stakeholders so that they can also provide their feedback. For whatever it's worth, we want to hear from them. They may, like you said in the beginning, in the introduction of this, they may have misunderstood something. They may be trying to defend a point. That's all right. Let them do it. We can take it and rationalize that comment later. But then in terms of what our council and the planning commission are going to do, and it goes back to my comment on the 5-foot setbacks. What I'm asking for is that when there are choices to be made, that some type of analysis of risk and benefit be provided to us non-professional people here, help us understand. We eventually have to say yes or no to the work product. And so you need to bring us along with the decision process. I noted, for instance, in here in several places, it says, okay, we, Halcyon Levine have to get with staff to negotiate essentially, or talk about, or, determine a path forward on certain specific issues. But council and commission play a role. You need to bring us along by giving us risks and benefits of the choices that are going to be proposed.
No, and we totally agree. And I apologize for the poor word choice within the diagnostic report. That should references to further discussion with staff should be expanded to further discussions with the community at large, with you all elected and appointed officials, and then of course administrative staff as well. So I apologize for that poor word choice. We can revise that within the diagnostic report to ensure that that is clear, that not only staff, but also the community at large, and importantly, the elected and appointed officials are consulted for that process.
I mean, just to reiterate John's point, with all due respect, 16 and 17 are like they are because of staff. So you need to be really careful there who you're going to for that advice.
Yeah, I mean, throughout this process, we anticipate this joint council, planning commission group being our sounding board. I think like John said at the beginning, sometimes we form a separate comprehensive plan advisory committee. And the goal of that committee is always to champion the process at the end when we get to elected and appointed officials. And the beauty of this setup here is that you'll be part of the process throughout the way. So there doesn't need to be a group to champion the process. So that's what we're anticipating throughout this project, is that you all will be involved every step of the way.
Any other comments or feedback?
Boy, after we get off this, I'd like to say something. It's not for them.
Gary, do you have something?
No, I'm good.
So you have, the next week, if you can, reach out to some of your contractors, review it, get your feedback to Patrick, make sure that we're moving him in the right direction so we don't have to go backwards and keep moving forwards. And Councilman Levine, thank you for all of your work. I'm really excited about this process and the changes that we're making.
Sure, Josh, can you let me know when you have posted those documents to the Picture Kingdom City 2040 website? And then we can get an email out to all of the interview stakeholders that we met with, to go and check these documents out.
Sure. I want to make sure that you're not talking about posting them publicly, but rather getting them out to the, well, we can chat tomorrow morning, Patrick, and figure out what we need to do.
I mean, why not post them publicly?
I mean, make it clear that at this point it's a draft, but I think the public ought to be able to see it in the interest of transparency.
Okay, absolutely.
Just so you know, this is a public meeting. These have already been posted publicly.
Sure, right.
Sure. Okay. If that's the direction, then we can definitely get it on the website first thing tomorrow. Absolutely.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, Planning Commission and staff. This meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you all.